It was an ordinary Tuesday afternoon when the package arrived. A simple brown box, unmarked, with no return address. The deliverman barely paused to knock before leaving it on my doorstep, and I couldn't help but feel an odd chill wash over me as I stared at it. There was something about it, something that made my stomach tighten with unease. I picked it up and brought it inside, placing it carefully on the coffee table. There was no label, no hint as to where it came from or who might have sent it. Curiosity gnawed at me. I had no idea who would send me something like this, but the fact that there was no return address made it feel like something more than just an anonymous gift. With a sense of reluctant anticipation, I sliced open the cardboard with a knife, the paper tearing with a sharp, satisfying sound. Inside, carefully wrapped in layers of tissue paper, was a painting. I pulled it out and gasped. The frame was ornate, gold, and intricate, and the canvas itself was worn but well preserved. The painting depicted a man in the kind of lavish attire one would expect from an aristocrat or nobleman of the past. An elaborate velvet coat, a cravat, and rings on his fingers that glittered with what looked like real jewels. His expression was stern, almost cold, with a gaze that seemed to pierce through the layers of time and space. There was an unsettling quality to the man in the painting. It wasn't just his gaze, though it was unervingly direct, as if he were looking at me and me alone. It was the way the shadows in the painting played across his face, making his features seem slightly off, like they were shifting just out of reach. The detail was exquisite, too perfect, too sharp, it almost seemed too real. I didn't know much about art, but I could tell that this was no ordinary piece. It had the weight of history behind it, and yet there was something undeniably eerie about it. I couldn't explain it, but my instincts told me something was wrong. I placed the painting against the wall in my hallway, thinking it would fit perfectly there. There was something about the space, an empty spot in the otherwise ordinary corridor, that seemed made for this piece of art. It was as if it belonged there, as if it had always been meant to hang in that very place. Still, the odd feeling lingered, making the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. I tried to shake it off, convincing myself it was just my imagination. But deep down I knew something wasn't right. I turned off the lights and went to bed, the thought of the painting lingering in my mind as I drifted off into uneasy sleep. It didn't take long for the oddities to begin. At first they were small things I could easily chalk up to my imagination. I had always been a bit of a skeptic, someone who looked for logical explanations and dismissed anything that couldn't be neatly explained away. But the more I thought about it, the harder it was to deny that something strange was happening. I had left for work that morning as usual, and when I returned home in the evening, I walked into the hallway and froze. The painting, the man in the velvet coat, had changed. At first I thought my eyes were playing tricks on me, but I stepped closer to the painting and noticed it. His eyes. They were no longer looking straight ahead, but seemed to be turned slightly in my direction. I shook my head, dismissing the thought. It had to be a trick of the light, I told myself. The way the shadows shifted in the hallway, or maybe the angle of the painting had changed slightly when I put it up. But the more I looked at it, the more I realized that it wasn't a trick of the light. The eyes, they were following me. His gaze was locked on me, and it was unsettling in a way that made my skin crawl. I decided to test it. I stood still in front of the painting, watching as the eyes remained fixed on me. I took a step to the side. The eyes followed. I moved back. Again, they followed, tracking my every movement. My heart began to race. I knew there was no way this was possible. Paintings didn't do that. Paintings didn't move. It was simply an illusion, I told myself. Maybe the angle at which I was viewing the painting was making it appear that way. Maybe it was all in my head. But when I returned to the hallway later that night, I noticed something even more disturbing. The man's head had shifted. The tilt was subtle, but it was there. His head was now turned further in my direction, as though he was looking directly at me, no longer just watching from the corner of his eyes. I couldn't deny it any longer. The painting was moving. A cold sweat broke out on my forehead as I stared at the man's gaze, now even more intense than before. His eyes followed me wherever I went in the hallway, his head turning ever so slightly, as though to track my every movement. I was starting to feel like I wasn't alone in the house anymore. The presence of the painting seemed to linger in the air, heavy and oppressive. I had to know. I couldn't leave it like this. The next morning, I took a step back and studied the painting carefully. His face was as lifelike as ever, and yet the subtle changes in his posture, the way his eyes followed me, the slight turn of his head, left me with an undeniable feeling that something was wrong. I decided to test my suspicions. Carefully, I took a pencil and marked a small, nearly invisible line along the frame where the head of the man had been. It wasn't much, but I hoped it would be enough to tell me if the painting was actually moving, or if I was simply losing my mind. The following day, I returned home to find that the mark I had made was still there, but the painting was different. His head was turned even further, as though the man had moved on his own. There was no denying it. The painting was alive. I couldn't shake the feeling that the painting was more than just a strange piece of art. Something about it, something about that man in the frame, felt alive, as though he were waiting for me to do something, or perhaps waiting for me to acknowledge him. I spent the next few days trying to ignore the unsettling presence of the painting, but every time I passed by the hallway, I could feel his eyes on me. They followed my movements, and the tilt of his head seemed to shift, more pronounced each time. I knew I wasn't imagining it. This was no longer just a weird occurrence. There was something otherworldly happening here, something I couldn't explain. Then one night I heard it. I had just settled into bed, the house quiet except for the soft hum of the refrigerator in the kitchen, when I heard a voice. It wasn't loud or clear at first, just a whisper that seemed to come from nowhere, but it was unmistakable. My heart skipped a beat as I froze, straining to hear. "Come closer," the voice said, its tone smooth and velvety, like honey. The sound sent chills down my spine, but there was something oddly compelling about it. Something that drew me in despite every instinct screaming for me to run. I sat up in bed, staring into the darkness, my eyes darting to the hallway where the painting hung. I couldn't see it from where I lay, but I knew the man was there waiting. The voice spoke again, clearer this time. "I see you. I've been waiting for you." A chill ran down my spine, and I felt the weight of dread pressing against my chest. I tried to dismiss it, to tell myself that I was hearing things, that it was just the wind or some other natural explanation. But deep down I knew this was something else. I couldn't take it any longer. I had to go to the painting. I don't know what pushed me to do it, fear or curiosity, but I found myself rising from my bed and walking down the hallway. The air felt colder now, and as I approached the painting, I felt a strange pull, like something was drawing me in. The eyes of the man in the painting were fixed on me, and his head had tilted once again, as though he were leaning forward to get a better look. "I offer you a gift," the voice continued, now more insistent. "Come closer, and see what I have prepared for you." My breath quickened as I stood there, staring at the painting. The man in the frame was so real, so vivid, that for a moment I almost believed he could step out of the canvas and into my world. His eyes were hypnotic, and I felt as if they were beckoning me, inviting me to step closer, to become part of whatever strange world he inhabited. But just as I was about to take a step forward, the voice spoke again, this time with a warning. "Refuse my invitation, and I will take your place." The words hung in the air like a dark promise. My heart thudded in my chest as I took a step back, the weight of his words sinking in. What did he mean? Take my place? I couldn't stop thinking about it. What would happen if I refused? What would he do? And just like that, I realized something. I had no choice. I couldn't ignore this. The painting was more than just a haunting presence. It was a doorway, a gateway to something far worse. I had no idea what had come over me. My mind was racing, filled with fear, confusion, and an overwhelming urge to understand what was happening. Every fiber of my being screamed at me to turn away, to leave the painting behind and forget everything. But the voice, that smooth, alluring voice, kept echoing in my mind. "Come closer." The words were like a magnet, pulling me toward the painting. My body felt frozen, as if an invisible force was guiding my every movement. I tried to resist, tried to remind myself that I was in control, but somehow it didn't feel that way. The fear wasn't enough to stop me. It was like I was under some kind of spell. I reached out, my fingers trembling as I neared the canvas. The man's eyes were locked on mine, and I could almost see the flicker of movement in them, as though he were waiting for me to make the final decision. For a moment, I hesitated. What was I doing? This couldn't be real. But then the voice came again, softer this time, almost soothing. "Don't be afraid. I only want to show you." And without warning, my hand touched the surface of the painting. The world around me seemed to tilt. The floor beneath me vanished, and I felt myself falling, or perhaps it was being pulled. It wasn't like falling into a pit or sinking into darkness. It was like I was being drawn into the very fabric of the painting, as though the edges of the world had dissolved and left me in another place entirely. I tried to scream, but the sound was swallowed by the air around me. The darkness swirled, and I could no longer tell where I ended and the painting began. The colors, the shapes, everything blurred together. It was like stepping through a veil, leaving one reality behind and entering another. Suddenly I was standing. No, not standing. I was floating. The ground beneath me wasn't solid. It was a strange, shifting surface that seemed to change with every step I took. The air felt thick, and the smell of dust and decay filled my lungs. I was no longer in my hallway, no longer in my home. I was somewhere else. I looked around, my heart pounding in my chest. What I saw before me was beyond anything I could have imagined. It was a theater, an ancient theater with high, arched ceilings, grand, velvet curtains, and a stage that seemed to stretch on forever. But it wasn't just any theater. It was a place of illusions, a place where nothing was as it seemed. The man from the painting stood before me, dressed in the same lavish clothes. His eyes gleamed with a knowing smile, and I could hear his voice echoing in my head again. "Welcome to my world," he said, his tone as smooth as ever. "I've been waiting for you." I looked around, trying to make sense of my surroundings. Everything seemed wrong, like the world had been twisted into a distorted version of itself. The walls were adorned with strange symbols, and the air felt thick with magic. "Where am I?" I asked, my voice shaking with uncertainty. "You're in my theater," the man said, his smile widening. "And now that you've entered, there's no turning back. You see, you've agreed to play a part in this show. And as with any performance, there are roles to be filled." I backed away, confusion mixing with fear. "What do you mean? I didn't agree to anything." "Oh, but you did," he said, his voice dripping with amusement. "By touching the painting, you made a choice. You entered my world, and now you will take the stage." I realized then that this was no ordinary man. He was something more. A magician? A sorcerer? No, he was a master of illusion, someone who had trapped me in this twisted realm. But I wasn't going to play his game. I wasn't going to let him control me. I turned to run, but the room seemed to stretch endlessly, and the more I tried to escape, the further I seemed to get from any kind of exit. There was no door, no way out. I was trapped. I felt the weight of his presence behind me, and I knew he was laughing. "You can't escape," he said, his voice echoing around me. "You're already part of the performance." I had to get out. There had to be a way. My heart raced in my chest, and every instinct told me to keep running. But there was nowhere to go. The theater stretched out in all directions, an endless maze of velvet curtains, golden chandeliers, and impossible angles. It was a place where the rules of the real world didn't apply. I could feel his eyes on me, like the weight of his gaze was pulling at me from every corner of this strange space. The man from the painting, the illusionist, the magician, whatever he was toying with me. "You're lost," his voice echoed, a soft whisper that seemed to come from all around me. "But don't worry, you'll find your way eventually." I stopped running. It was pointless. Panic was no use here. I had to think, to find a way out. The theater might be endless, but it was also a construct. It was his creation, and every illusion had a flaw. Every trap had an escape. I turned to face him, trying to ignore the fear clawing at my insides. "You think you can fool me?" I said, trying to sound more confident than I felt. "But I know what you're doing. I know this is all just an illusion." He stepped closer, his smile widening, his eyes glowing with amusement. Do you really understand?" I gritted my teeth, trying to hide the doubt creeping in. "You use illusions, tricks, sleight of hand. That's all this is. And if there's one thing I know about magicians, it's that they can't do anything that isn't part of their act." He laughed, the sound rich and dark, like the echo of thunder. "You think you can outwit me? I am the master here. I have trapped many souls before you, and none of them escaped. But I wasn't just any soul. I'd made it this far, and I wasn't going to let him win." "Maybe you've trapped them," I said, the words coming with more certainty now. "But maybe that's because they were too afraid to look for the cracks in your illusions. You rely on fear, on trickery. But there's always a way out. Every illusion has its flaws. Every cage has its weak point." His smile faltered, just for a moment. "You don't understand. This is no illusion. This is my world. You're just a player in my show." I shook my head. "That's where you're wrong. This is an illusion, and I'm going to prove it." The moment I said it, something shifted in the air. The room seemed to warp, bending slightly at the edges, like the illusion was starting to flicker. The walls didn't seem so solid anymore. I could feel the magic, the energy that held this place together, begin to tremble. I realized then that the power he had over me wasn't absolute. It was a lie, a manipulation. He thrived on my fear, on my uncertainty. But I wasn't afraid anymore. I had learned enough about his tricks to see through them. "I won't play your game," I said, my voice stronger now. "I'll find my way out. And when I do, you'll be the one trapped." The illusionist's expression darkened, and the air around me grew colder. "You think you can break free? You're not the first to try, and you won't be the last to fail." But I could see it now, the cracks in his carefully constructed world. I could see the shimmer in the air, the edges of the illusion where the magic wasn't quite holding. It was like the fabric of this reality was starting to tear. "You're wrong," I said again, more quietly this time, but with conviction. "You've already lost. You just don't know it yet." I closed my eyes and took a deep breath. When I opened them again, I focused on the cracks, on the weak points in the illusion. I had to break through, to destroy the very foundation that held this place together. I stepped forward, determined to push past the fear and doubt. With every step, the world around me seemed to shift and distort, as though it couldn't decide whether I was a part of it or an outsider. The illusionist's voice echoed in my mind, but I ignored it. I could hear him getting closer, but I didn't look back. I kept moving forward. And then, in a moment of clarity, I reached out and touched the air itself, the place where the illusion began to unravel. The moment my fingers made contact, everything changed. The walls of the theater dissolved like mist, and the space around me warped and bent. For a heartbeat, I thought I might be torn apart by the force of it. But then, just as suddenly as it had begun, the world snapped back into focus. I was standing in the hallway again, back in my apartment. The air felt normal still. The weight of the illusion was gone. But I wasn't alone. Behind me, the painting hung on the wall, silent, still, but something was different. The man was gone, and in his place, there was only empty canvas. I had broken free, but I knew that the man, the magician, was still there, somewhere, trapped within the very world he had created. And though I had escaped, I couldn't shake the feeling that he wasn't finished with me yet. It was over. At least I thought it was. The silence in my apartment felt heavier now, the air thick with the remnants of something I couldn't fully comprehend. I stood frozen in front of the painting, unsure if I was still in the world I knew. The canvas was empty. No figure, no smile, no eyes watching me from the darkened frame. I reached out cautiously, almost as if expecting the painting to leap back to life the moment I touched it. But nothing happened. The frame felt cold and real in my hands, just as it had before I entered that cursed world. I pulled it off the wall, intending to dispose of it once and for all. I wasn't sure whether I should burn it or simply throw it away, but I knew I couldn't keep it. Not after what had happened. Not after what it had almost done to me. With every step I took toward the door, I felt the weight of the experience pressing down on me. The theater, the magician, the twisted circus of illusions. It all felt like a nightmare that I had somehow woken from. But nightmares linger. They leave something behind, a residue of fear and doubt that stays long after the waking world returns to normal. I didn't know what was worse, the thought of burning the painting and possibly freeing the illusionist, or the thought of keeping it and living with the reminder of everything that happened. I chose the latter, though, tossing the cursed thing into the deepest corner of my closet. Out of sight, but never really gone. Days passed, and the world outside seemed to move on, unaffected by what I had experienced. I returned to my usual routines, working, eating, sleeping, trying to forget, trying to convince myself that it was all just a bad dream. But even in the quiet moments, there were flashes, glimpses of that theater, the magician's chilling smile, the endless hallways stretching into infinity. And then came the dreams. It wasn't long before they started. The same theater, the same man, but this time, something had changed. The illusionist's face was darker, twisted, his once dazzling smile now a cruel leer. He would call my name from the shadows, his voice thick with malice. "You think you're free," he would say, "but you will always be mine." I woke up in cold sweats, my heart pounding in my chest, the remnants of his voice still echoing in my ears. It wasn't just the dreams, though. There was something else, a lingering sense that he was still watching me, waiting. One night I finally gave in. I couldn't ignore it any longer. I opened the closet, pulled out the frame, and stared at it one last time. Nothing had changed. The canvas was still empty. The painting was still just a relic of a twisted past, a broken illusion. But as I stood there staring at it, I realized something. The fear had lessened. It wasn't gone, but it had faded. Maybe that was the worst part. The magician, the painting, everything I had experienced had become a part of me. It had marked me in a way I couldn't escape. And that was what truly terrified me. The painting might have disappeared, but the scar remained. A scar that no one could see, but that I would carry with me for the rest of my life. And sometimes, in the dead of night, when the world was still and the silence seemed too heavy to bear, I would catch a glimpse of the empty frame, just a flicker, a shadow, a trick of the light. And for a moment, I would swear I saw his smile again.